The day Calvin Brooks walked into that courtroom, the town of Harlan, Georgia had already made up its mind. People lined the benches like they were settling in for a sermon, arms crossed, mouths tight, eyes that had spent 21 years quietly deciding what kind of man Calvin was. A black man who had taken in 2 white children, a mechanic who had no business raising anybody, a widower with no family left, no roots worth speaking of, no reason good enough to explain why he had done what he did. They said he had never truly loved Owen and Claire Whitfield. They said he had taken them in for the government checks, for the sympathy of strangers, for the shield that 2 small white faces gave a black man in a town that was always looking for a reason. They said he had built himself a reputation on the backs of 2 orphan children, and that the kindness people had mistaken for goodness was nothing more than a long, careful performance. But then, the doors opened. A young man in a charcoal suit walked in first, broad-shouldered, jaw-set, carrying a leather briefcase worn soft at the corners. Behind him came a woman in her late 20s, notebook tucked under her arm, press badge clipped to her lapel, eyes scanning the room the way people do when they have already done their homework and are simply waiting for the world to catch up. They did not sit in the gallery. They walked to the front, and when the young man set his briefcase down at the defense table and the woman took her seat just behind him, Calvin Brooks, 55 years old, graying at the temples, hands still rough from 20 years of engine grease, looked up at them and pressed his lips together hard, the way a man does when he is trying not to come apart in public. They had not come to watch. They had come to call him father. And the question that would silence every person in that room before the morning was over, the question nobody had thought to ask in 21 years was this: who had truly used those children all along? The night Calvin found them, it was raining the way it only rains in Georgia in late October, not in sheets, but in a steady, indifferent pour, the kind that soaks through everything and makes the world feel smaller than it already is. He was locking up the shop. Harlan Auto and Repair sat at the edge of town where the county road curved away from the main strip. A one-bay garage with a hand-painted sign, a truck lift that groaned when the temperature dropped, and a back office where Calvin kept a coffee maker and a small framed photograph of his wife on the shelf above the desk. Diana Brooks had died 4 years earlier, on a Tuesday morning in March, when a delivery truck ran a red light at the intersection of Millbrook and 5th. She had been 30 years old. They had been trying for a baby for almost 2 years. The doctors said there was no reason it should not have worked. It simply had not. After she died, Calvin went back to work after 10 days because he did not know what else to do with himself. He fixed engines. He kept the photograph on the shelf. He stopped going to the places they used to go together, which meant he stopped going to most places. On Sunday mornings, when Diana used to volunteer at the old First Light Church on Beaumont Road, organizing donated clothing, sorting canned goods, making coffee for whoever needed it, Calvin would sometimes drive past the building just to have somewhere to go. The church had been closed for 2 years by then. The congregation had moved to a newer building across town. The old structure sat empty, its white paint peeling, its parking lot full of pine needles and old leaves. That night, pulling the shop's rolling door down against the rain, Calvin saw something move under the church's front overhang. He almost kept walking. He stood in the rain for a moment, water running off the brim of his cap, and looked across the empty lot at 2 shapes pressed against the church's front wall, too small to be adults, too still to be anything good. He crossed the lot. The boy was 8 years old and had positioned himself slightly in front of the girl in a way that was not quite conscious and not quite brave, just automatic, the way a child learns to stand when the world has taught him that someone needs to be in front. He had dark blonde hair plastered flat against his forehead and eyes that assessed Calvin the way eyes do when they have learned that the first few seconds of meeting a stranger are the most important. The girl was 6. She had her brother's coloring and her mother's kerchief, a small square of faded blue cotton clutched in both hands, pressed against her chest. She did not speak. She did not look up. She simply held that piece of cloth and waited for whatever came next. "You two been out here long?" Calvin asked. The boy said nothing. "I got heat inside," Calvin said, "and I think there's a sleeve of crackers in the back office. You don't have to talk to me, you can just come inside." The boy looked at him for a long moment, Then he looked at his sister. Then he took her hand and followed Calvin across the lot. Their names, Calvin learned over the next hour, were Owen and Claire Whitfield. Their mother, Renee, had died of a cardiac event 6 weeks earlier at 34 years old. No history, no warning, just gone between one breath and the next. Their father had not been in the picture for years. There was no other family anyone had been able to locate. The county had placed them with a foster family in Macon. The placement had lasted 11 days before Owen had called the social services hotline from a gas station payphone. They had been moved again. Then again. Owen told Calvin this in a flat, careful voice, the way a child recounts facts he has decided not to feel anymore. Claire said nothing. She ate 4 crackers and drank half a cup of water and kept her eyes on her brother. Calvin called the after-hours social services line, then sat down on the concrete floor of the back office across from the 2 children because the only chair was behind the desk and he did not want a desk between them. "Someone's going to come tonight," he said. "Or first thing in the morning." Owen nodded. "Where are they going to take us?" Claire asked. It was the first thing she had said. Her voice was smaller than her face. Calvin did not answer right away, because the honest answer was that he did not know, and he had already understood sitting on that floor, looking at a 6-year-old girl clutching a dead woman's kerchief, that the honest answer was not good enough. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I'm going to find out." He did not sleep that night. He sat in the office after the children fell asleep on the folding cot he kept for the occasional overnight job, and he drank bad coffee, and he thought about Diana, which he had not allowed himself to do in a concentrated way for a long time. She would have known exactly what to do. She would have already had names and numbers and a plan. She would have been on the phone with 3 different people before he had even finished the crackers. And she would have been doing it not because she felt obligated, but because she genuinely, specifically, impractically loved the idea of people being taken care of. Calvin was not Diana. He knew that. But he was in her church, on her floor, with 2 children who had nowhere to go. He applied for temporary guardianship the next morning. The town did not approve. This was not said directly, it rarely was. In Harlan, it was said in the way Mrs. Patricia Gould at the diner told him she hoped he knew what he was getting into. It was said in the way his neighbor, Walter Sims, shook his head slowly and told Calvin that some folks were already talking. It was said in the way the social services caseworker, a woman named Brenda Tate, came to inspect his house 3 times in the first 2 weeks, checking the smoke detectors, asking about his income, reviewing his background check again, making notes she did not share with him. 2 of his regulars at the shop stopped bringing their cars in. He did not ask why. He already knew. Some of the black men he had known for years pulled him aside and told him he was drawing the wrong kind of attention. That any mistake he made, a missed school pickup, a bad grade, a bruise from a bicycle fall, would be used against him in ways it would not be used against a white father. They were not wrong. Calvin thanked them and kept going. It was at the second of Brenda Tate's home visits that he first encountered Dorothy Haynes. She arrived just as Brenda was wrapping up, dressed in a pressed linen blazer despite the cold, carrying a casserole dish covered in aluminum foil as though she happened to be in the neighborhood. She introduced herself as the president of the Harlan Parent Community Board and the director of the Harlan Children's Fund, a local nonprofit that provided support to foster families and orphaned children in the county. She had a warm voice and a practiced smile, and she spoke about Owen and Claire with a familiarity that made Calvin's shoulders tighten. She directed most of her questions toward Brenda. How was little Claire adjusting? Was she sleeping? Had she been evaluated by a child psychologist? She mentioned, almost offhandedly, that she had a contact who had always wanted children and a beautiful home out on Sycamore Lane, and that if temporary arrangements became permanent, it would be worth thinking about what kind of environment would best serve a child of Claire's here. She paused just long enough to make the pause its own sentence sensitivity. She never mentioned Owen. Calvin walked her to the door at the end of the visit. She squeezed his arm with both hands and told him he was a good man for doing this. Her eyes did not match her mouth. After she left, Calvin wrote her name in the small notebook he kept in the kitchen drawer. He had started keeping the notebook the week he applied for guardianship. He told himself it was just being organized. He was beginning to understand it was more than that. He was granted permanent guardianship 4 months after the night he found them. The paperwork came on a Thursday. Calvin read it twice at the kitchen table, then folded it carefully and put it in the wooden box on the bedroom shelf, the same box where he kept Diana's photograph, the receipt from their first dinner out, and a birthday card she had written him 2 months before she died. That night, Claire had a nightmare. Calvin was in the hallway outside her room when he heard her not crying exactly, more a sound between crying and calling, the word mom folded into it somewhere. He stood at her door with his hand on the frame and did not open it. He knew, in the way you know things about frightened children without being told, that opening the door without warning would make it worse. So he did the only other thing he could think of. "I'm right here," he said, quietly, through the door. "I'm not going to open it unless you want me to. But I'm not going anywhere either." He sat down on the floor of the hallway, back against the wall, and waited. In the morning, Claire opened the door and found him asleep against the baseboard, his chin on his chest, a cold cup of coffee on the floor beside him. She stood there for a moment. Then she went back inside, got the blanket from her bed, and draped it over his shoulders. When Calvin woke up, Owen was standing in the hallway watching him. The boy did not say anything, but he did not take his sister's hand and pull her away, which was what he had done every other time Calvin had gotten too close. It was not much. It was the beginning. The first year was the hardest, and also, in ways Calvin would not fully understand until much later, the most ordinary. Owen needed structure the way some children need medicine, not because anyone had told him he did, but because he had spent 2 years in a system that offered none, and his body had learned to brace for chaos the way a person braces before a door slams. He woke at the same time, every morning without an alarm. He made his bed with the corners tucked. He finished his homework before dinner and set his backpack by the front door the night before school. Calvin did not ask him to do any of these things. He simply let Owen do them, and made sure the house was the kind of place where doing them made sense. Claire was different. She came back slowly, the way color comes back to something that has been left in the dark. For the first 3 months, she spoke mainly in single words and short answers, communicating most things through proximity. If she was uncomfortable, she moved to the room Owen was in. If she was content, she would sometimes sit near Calvin while he worked on paperwork at the kitchen table, not talking, just present, the blue kerchief folded in her lap. She started drawing in the 4th month. Pencil sketches on the backs of grocery lists, on paper bags, on the margins of schoolwork, mostly houses, always with someone standing outside them. Calvin framed one and hung it in the hallway without saying anything about it. The next morning, Claire stood in front of it for a long time. "That's a bad drawing," she said finally. "I like it," Calvin said. She looked at him sideways. "Why? Person outside the house looks like they're staying," he said. She thought about this, then walked to the kitchen for breakfast. But she glanced at the drawing again on her way past, and Calvin, who had been watching from the corner of his eye, saw the smallest possible version of a smile. The town watched all of this with the attention reserved for things people disapprove of but cannot directly stop. At the first parent-teacher conference of the school year, Owen's homeroom teacher, a woman named Mrs. Draper, with careful eyes and a practiced voice, looked up from her grade folder when Calvin walked in and said, "Oh, are you Owen's? Are you picking him up today?" "I'm his father," Calvin said. Mrs. Draper made a small sound that was not quite a word and shuffled her papers. She told him Owen was performing above grade level in reading and mathematics. She told him Owen tended to sit alone at lunch. She did not ask Calvin anything about himself, or about Owen's home life, or whether there was anything the school could do to support the transition. She thanked him for coming. She did not shake his hand. In the parking lot afterward, a woman Calvin did not know stopped him with the confidence of someone who believes their concern is a gift. "Those children have been through so much," she said. "I just hope they're not being put into an even more complicated situation." Calvin looked at her for a moment. "What situation would be less complicated?" he asked. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Calvin walked to his truck. He drove home and wrote her comment in the notebook. He had begun to fill it with a methodical quiet that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the understanding that he was living a life that would need to be proven, someday, to someone who had already decided not to believe it. Every school report card, every pediatric visit, Every permission slip, utility bill, grocery receipt. He kept them in manila folders in the filing cabinet in the office and wrote the date on each one in black marker. It was the most meticulous thing he had ever done, and he never spoke of it to anyone, because to speak of it would have required explaining why, and the why was not something he wanted Owen or Claire to ever have to hear. Dorothy Haynes came around twice a year, reliably. Once in the spring, around the time the Children's Fund held its annual fundraising gala, and once in the fall, when the new foster placement cycle began. She always arrived with something: a pie, a bag of school supplies, once a gift card to the grocery store that Calvin thanked her for, and quietly sat on his neighbor's doorstep the same evening. She was unfailingly pleasant. She remembered the children's birthdays. She spoke about the fund's work with genuine fluency and a statistics-ready enthusiasm that Calvin recognized, over time, as the voice of someone who had confused accounting for caring. To Calvin's face, she was warmth itself. He heard the other version secondhand, from his regular customer Ray Pickett, who drove a delivery truck for the county and had a wife who volunteered at the school library. Ray told him, carefully and with some embarrassment, that Dorothy had been heard saying at a board meeting that she was not sure Calvin was the right long-term solution for either child, that the fund was monitoring the situation, that there were families, established families, two-parent households, families with means who had expressed interest in providing a more stable environment. Calvin thanked Ray and did not say anything else. He went home that evening and looked at Owen at the kitchen table, finishing his algebra homework, and Claire on the living room floor drawing houses, and he felt something. He did not have a clean name for something between fury and grief and a cold, resolute steadiness, and he went to the kitchen and started making dinner. Owen was 16 when the fault line cracked open. It had been building for months in the way these things build, not in grand gestures, but in the small daily accumulations of a boy, trying to explain himself to a world that kept making him feel like an explanation was required. His friend group had shifted. The boys he ate lunch with now were louder, quicker to judge, and carried the confidence of teenagers who have not yet been asked to justify their belonging anywhere. They said things with the casualness of people who do not know their words have weight. Calvin heard it secondhand, from Claire, who heard it from a girl in Owen's class, that someone had told Owen it was embarrassing, having a black dad, that another kid had said something worse, more specific, the kind of thing that does not need to be repeated to be understood. He did not raise it with Owen directly. He waited. The fight, when it came, was about nothing: a missed curfew by 20 minutes, a jacket left on the floor, the friction of a 16-year-old running out of patience with a world he could not control, and finding the nearest available surface to push against. Owen stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and said, "You don't understand. You never understand. People look at me like I'm some kind of because of you. Because of how this looks." Calvin set down the dish he was drying. "Because of how what looks," he said. His voice was even. He had not raised his voice at either of the children in 8 years, and he did not raise it now. "You know what I mean," Owen said. "I want to hear you say it." Owen looked at the floor. His jaw was working. Because people see us, and they think it's weird. They say things. And I'm tired of having to defend. I'm tired of explaining to everyone that you're my dad." The word dad landed in the room like something Owen had not meant to say and could not take back. Silence. Then Claire said, from the hallway where she had been standing, "Owen, stop." Owen grabbed his jacket off the floor and walked out the front door. Calvin found him an hour later. He had driven to 4 places: first Owen's school, the park on Redmond, the diner on 5th, before he understood where Owen would go. He turned the truck around and drove to Beaumont Road. Owen was sitting on the front steps of the old First Light Church, jacket pulled tight, rain starting again, not looking at anything in particular. Calvin parked and walked across the lot and sat down next to him on the steps without saying anything. They sat in the rain for several minutes. "I'm not mad at you," Calvin said finally. Owen said nothing. "You're not wrong that people talk," Calvin said. "They've been talking since the first week. That part's not going to stop." Owen turned his head slightly. "What I want you to know," Calvin said, "is that I can't make the world kinder overnight. I've tried to figure out how to do that, and I can't. What I can do is make sure you don't have to go through that world alone." He paused. "That's the only thing I know how to promise. And I've been keeping it." Owen stared at the ground for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was rougher than he wanted it to be. "I don't hate you. I want you to know, I don't hate you." "I know that," Calvin said. "I just get tired." "I know that too." They sat there until the rain lightened. Calvin did not put his arm around the boy. He did not ask for anything. He simply stayed, the way he had stayed outside Claire's door 10 years ago, and waited. On the drive home, Owen sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the wet road. "Dad," he said, not quite to Calvin, more to the window. Calvin kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah," he said. From that night forward, Owen called him Dad in public. Not loudly, not as a demonstration, just as a fact, the way you state facts that have stopped requiring explanation. 3 weeks later, Claire turned in an English assignment on the theme of home. Her teacher, a young woman named Miss Adler, who was one of the few people at Harlan Elementary who had treated Calvin like a parent and not a phenomenon, called him that evening. "I wanted you to hear this before I handed it back," she said, and read him the last paragraph. "A family is not a thing that looks a certain way. A family is the person who stays outside the door the whole night so you don't have to be afraid of the dark anymore. I know, because I have one." Calvin thanked Miss Adler and hung up the phone. He went to the wooden box on the bedroom shelf, took out Diana's birthday card, and set it aside. Then he folded Claire's essay carefully, with the same precision he used on documents that mattered, and placed it at the bottom of the box. He stood there for a while with his hand on the lid. Then he closed it, turned off the light, and went to check if the kids had eaten dinner. The years passed in the way years do when you are too busy living them to catalog them properly. Owen graduated from Harlan High with honors, attended the University of Georgia on a partial scholarship, then went straight through to law school at Emory, without interruption, finishing at 26. He specialized in wrongful conviction defense, representing people who had been failed by the same systems he had once been at the mercy of. He was methodical, precise, and known among his colleagues for a patience in the courtroom that some of them found unnerving. He called Calvin every Sunday. Claire studied journalism at Georgia State, then spent 3 years at a regional paper covering county government, before moving to an investigative unit focused on nonprofit accountability and child welfare systems. She had been doing that work for 2 years when the story she was quietly building began to intersect with something much closer to home. She called Calvin on Tuesday evenings and on his birthday, and sometimes on random Wednesday afternoons, for no reason she could explain. She had kept the blue kerchief. It lived in the front pocket of whatever bag she carried. Calvin stayed in Harlan. He kept the shop. He shoveled his neighbor's walk in winter and showed up to the school carnival every year to volunteer at the parking booth, even after both his children had aged out of the school entirely. He was known in town as a quiet man, a reliable man, the kind of man whose name came up when someone needed a favor done without ceremony. Dorothy Haynes was still the director of the Children's Fund. She had expanded the organization's reach considerably over the years, and her name appeared regularly in the local paper in connection with fundraisers, galas, and civic awards. Calvin received the fund's newsletter in the mail each quarter. He read it carefully and filed it in the cabinet with everything else. The three of them had dinner together the last Thursday of August, the year Owen turned 29. Owen had driven down from Atlanta for a deposition in a neighboring county. Claire had come from Savannah, where she had been working on a story she described only as involving a lot of spreadsheets and a nonprofit whose annual reports had begun to show numbers she could not reconcile. She looked tired, in the way of a person who has found something they cannot unfind and is still deciding what to do with it. They ate the same meal Calvin had been making on special occasions since the children were: small pot roast, green beans, cornbread from the box, because he had never managed the scratch version, though he had tried many times. Owen teased him about the cornbread. Claire defended it with the loyalty of someone who had eaten it her whole life and was not interested in objectivity. Calvin watched the two of them argue across the table and felt the quiet, settled pleasure of a man who knows exactly what he is looking at and understands that this is enough. At some point, Claire looked up from her plate and said, "How's business been? Anything different lately?" "Steady," Calvin said. I've had county contracts for a few years now. Maintenance work, mostly. School buses, program vehicles. He paused, then added, because she was watching him with the attentiveness she reserved for things that deserved it. I've had some questions about paperwork lately. Invoices that don't match what I actually charged. Claire set her fork down. Owen stopped mid-sentence. What kind of mismatch? Claire said. The kind where someone is billing more than the work costs. One of the drivers for the Children's Fund Transportation Program left a billing summary in his cab last week when he brought the van in. The number on his sheet was 3 times what I charged. I pulled my original invoice. The difference is consistent, going back at least 4 cycles. Neither of them said anything for a moment. How long have you been sitting on that? Owen asked. 3 weeks. I wanted to be sure before I did anything. I called the county procurement office to ask about the reporting process, just to understand the procedure. Owen was quiet. Who did you speak with there? A clerk. I didn't give my name. Calvin looked at him steadily. I was careful. Owen nodded slowly. Don't file anything yet, he said. Let me think about how to approach it properly. Claire had already picked up her phone. None of them knew, sitting at that table over cold cornbread and the low hum of the kitchen light, that the call to the county office had been enough. That someone had already made a different call. That it was the last ordinary evening for a very long time. Dorothy Haynes filed the civil suit 6 days later. The complaint named Calvin Brooks as having willfully exploited 2 minors in the state foster care system for personal financial gain, emotional manipulation, and deliberate isolation from their natural community. It alleged that he had used the children as instruments of social legitimacy, controlling their access to relationships and resources in ways that caused lasting psychological harm. It called for damages and an official review of his fitness as a guardian during the period of the children's minority. Calvin read the document twice at the kitchen table. Then he read the exhibits. Every act of care had been inverted. The filing cabinet of records he had kept for 2 decades was described as evidence of obsessive surveillance. The night he had sat outside Claire's door had been recorded in a statement from a neighbor who claimed to have heard Calvin speaking to the child in a manner that was controlling and distressing. The evening he had driven through the rain to find Owen at the old church was cited as an incident of intimidation. Then he found the essay. Claire had written it at 11 years old. Dorothy's attorneys had obtained a copy through a subpoena of the school district's archived student records, made possible by Dorothy's long-standing role as a County Children's Services Advisory Board member, a position that had given her access to documents no civil plaintiff should ordinarily have been able to reach. They described her words, "A family is the person who stays outside the door the whole night," as evidence that the minor had been psychologically conditioned to interpret surveillance as love. Calvin sat at the table for a long time. Then he went to the shelf and took down the wooden box. He looked at the essay. He looked at Diana's photograph. He thought about the advice his attorney, a decent man named Gerald Watts, had given him that morning, that the cleanest path forward, given the publicity the suit had already generated, might be a negotiated settlement, an acknowledgement of certain procedural failures, a modest payment, a resolution that kept both sides out of a courtroom. He thought about Owen and Claire, about what it would mean to bring them back to Harlan, to ask them to sit in that courtroom, to make them relive, in front of the town that had watched them grow up, every year they had spent simply trying to be a family. He thought about the fact that they had left this place, that they had built lives, that they were safe and whole and doing something real in the world. He could sign the paper. He could absorb it. He had absorbed worse. He picked up the pen. He held it above the line. He set it down. He told himself it was because Gerald had asked him to wait until morning. But the truth was simpler. Something in him would not move. He sat at that table until the kitchen went dark around him. And then he went to bed without signing anything. And he did not fully understand until the next morning, when his phone rang at 6:47, that he had been waiting for a reason. "Don't sign anything," Owen said. His voice had the quality of someone who had been awake for several hours and had moved past tired into something cleaner and colder. "I mean it, Dad. Not a word. Not an initial. Nothing." Calvin sat on the edge of the bed. Outside, the early light was coming through the curtains in thin strips. "Owen, Claire called me last night. I've already read the complaint. I've also started pulling the Children's Fund's public filings for the last 7 years. Soon, we're coming home. Calvin closed his eyes. He thought of the two of them as he had last seen them, Owen in the doorway of his car, Claire, waving from the driveway, both of them, whole and unhurried, with their whole lives arranged in front of them at a safe distance from this town. You don't have to do this. I can handle. Dad. Owen's voice was quiet, not sharp. Quiet in the way of something that has been decided. You stayed. When every person in Harlan was waiting for you to walk away, you stayed. You sat outside Claire's door on the floor all night. You drove to that church in the rain. You kept every receipt and every report card for 20 years because you knew someone was going to try to use your love against you someday. He paused. You knew, and you stayed anyway. Calvin said nothing. So that's what we're doing, Owen said. We're staying. They arrived the following afternoon. Owen came in his car. Claire came in a rental, and she came with 3 boxes of documents she had spent the previous 48 hours compiling the Children's Fund's public tax filings going back 9 years, a series of invoices she had obtained through a public records request, and a recorded phone interview with a former fund accountant named Terrence Webb, who had left the organization 4 years ago and had, once Claire found him, been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Calvin watched them carry the boxes into the house. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his arms at his sides and felt something he did not have language for, not relief exactly, not gratitude exactly, something closer to the ache of a man who has spent a long time believing he is a burden and is suddenly, undeniably, being shown otherwise. You didn't have to come back here, he said. Claire set her box on the kitchen table and looked at him with the expression she had been perfecting since she was 11 years old, the one that communicated, without cruelty, that he had said something that did not deserve a serious response. Stop it, she said. I'm serious. You had. Dad. She crossed the kitchen and put her arms around him, which she did not do easily, and therefore only did when she meant it. You're not something we came back to take care of. You're someone we came back to stand next to. There's a difference. Calvin put one arm around her and stared at the wall over her shoulder and kept his face very still. Owen, who had been quiet in the doorway, said, I'm also going to need your filing cabinet. All of it. Calvin laughed, despite himself. It was a short, rough sound, but it was real. He pulled back from Claire and straightened his shirt and went to get the cabinet key. The trial was set for a Tuesday in late September. The week before it began, 3 things happened. His neighbor Walter Sims, who had shaken his head all those years ago, who had warned Calvin about drawing the wrong kind of attention, came to the front door on a Sunday evening with a casserole and a handshake and told Calvin he had been wrong, that he had been watching for 20 years, even when he had not let on, that he was sorry it had taken him this long to say so. Calvin accepted both and did not say anything beyond thank you, because anything more would have required him to be a bigger man than he felt like being that particular evening. Miss Adler, Claire's elementary school teacher, retired now, living in Augusta, called Owen and offered to provide a written statement about the essay. Owen thanked her and told her they had it covered, but he told Calvin about the call that night at the kitchen table, and Calvin looked out the window for a while without speaking. And Gerald Watts, reviewing the documents Claire had compiled and the counter filings Owen had prepared, called Calvin and told him quietly that he had been doing this for 30 years and the other side's case was not what he had initially assessed it to be. You've got a good lawyer, Gerald said. I've got my son, Calvin said. Gerald was quiet for a moment. That's what I mean, he said. The courtroom was full. Harlan's circuit court had not seen this kind of attendance in years. The benches were packed with people who had known Calvin for 2 decades and had opinions about him, his customers, his neighbors, his children's teachers, his quiet critics, and his quieter defenders. Dorothy Haynes sat in the front row in a gray blazer, her posture immaculate, her expression composed into the stillness of someone who believes the outcome has already been determined. Her attorney, a man named Richard Calloway, who came up from Savannah and had the practiced fluency of someone paid to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things, sat at the plaintiff's table reviewing his notes. Owen sat at the defense table. Calvin sat beside him. He had worn his good shirt and his one jacket, both of which he had pressed himself the night before, and he held himself with the stillness of a man who has decided to be calm regardless of what happens because becoming otherwise is not something he can afford. He kept his eyes forward. Richard Calloway's opening was precise and well-rehearsed, and built around a story Calvin had heard before, in different forms, for most of the last 21 years. The story in which a man with insufficient credentials had inserted himself into the lives of two vulnerable children for reasons that served himself rather than them, in which every protective instinct had been reframed as self-interest, in which 21 years of showing up every single day, in every small and unwitnessed way, was collapsed into a pattern of manipulation and control. Calloway spoke about the government assistance Calvin had received as a foster parent, sums that, tallied across the years and presented without context, sounded like profit. He spoke about the night Owen had left the house at 16 as evidence of a traumatic home environment. He spoke about Calvin's record-keeping as the behavior of a man managing an asset, not raising a child. He spoke, finally, about the essay. He described Claire's words, "A family is the person who stays outside the door the whole night," as the product of a child who had been conditioned to interpret surveillance as love. Calvin's jaw tightened. Owen wrote something on the legal pad in front of him and underlined it. Owen's opening was shorter. He stood without notes, though he had written pages of them, because he had decided the night before that this argument needed to sound like what it was, a son speaking about his father and not like a performance. "The plaintiff has described my father as a man who kept meticulous records of every expenditure over 21 years, Owen said. "That's accurate. He did. I'd like to explain why." He paused. Because he knew, from the first week, that there would be a room like this one someday, that someone would look at a black man raising two white children and decide that the most plausible explanation was profit, not love, not grief. Not a man who found two kids on the steps of a church in the rain and could not bring himself to walk away. He paused again. He kept those records because he knew the world was going to ask him to prove that loving us wasn't a crime. The room was very quiet. That is not the behavior of a man who was hiding something. That is the behavior of a man who understood exactly what kind of scrutiny he was under and chose to stay anyway. Owen looked once at Calvin, then back at the room. "I intend to show you every dollar my father spent on our behalf, every document he kept, every receipt in every folder, and when you have seen all of it, I would like you to ask yourself, what kind of man keeps that kind of record? Whether it looks more like accounting or like love that had been forced to learn to speak the language of evidence." The documentary phase took 2 days. Owen was meticulous. He walked the court through Calvin's bank records, year by year, not summarized, not approximated, but line by line. The foster care stipend, the amounts, what had been spent, and how, school supplies, pediatric appointments, the orthodontist Owen had needed at 14, the art classes Claire had attended at the community center for 3 years, starting at age 9. The new tires on Calvin's truck deferred 2 years because both children needed winter coats. The cornbread mix which Owen noted, and which produced a brief, confused stir in the gallery before people understood that he was establishing the pattern of an ordinary household rather than an institution. He entered into evidence the letter from Owen's high school principal commending Calvin's consistent involvement, the pediatrician's records, noting both children's steady developmental progress and their parents' engaged participation in every appointment. Character statements from 4 teachers, 1 school counselor, 1 from Gerald Watts, and 1 from Ray Pickett, who had driven down from his retirement in Valdosta and sat in the gallery in his best shirt. By the end of the second day, the allegation that Calvin had profited financially from the arrangement had been reduced to a position that required willful misreading of a 2-decade paper trail to sustain. Calloway adjusted. He was good enough to adjust. He moved his emphasis to the psychological claims. The night outside the door. The pursuit in the rain. The essay. Claire took the stand on the 3rd morning. She had been in the gallery for 2 days, watching. She was good at watching. It was most of what her job required, and she had spent the time not only following the proceedings but reading the room, which faces were moving, which had gone still, where the current of opinion was running. She took the stand in a dark blue blazer with the blue kerchief folded in her jacket pocket, and she sat with the composure of someone who knows exactly how frightened they are and has decided to do the thing anyway. Calloway approached her with the careful pleasantness of an attorney who intends to be unpleasant but wants to be liked for it. He asked about her childhood. She answered. He asked about the therapy she had received as a teenager, and she answered that too, in a way that was honest and unashamed and gave him nothing to use. He asked about the night Owen had left the house at 16, and she described it plainly and did not editorialize. Then he asked the question. "Miss Brooks," he said, using the name she had taken legally at 18, in the interest of honesty, and understanding that this court is trying to assess the full picture of your upbringing, was there ever a time when you were ashamed of your father? The room shifted. Claire looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said. The room shifted again, differently. Calloway kept his expression neutral, but his posture changed slightly, the posture of a man who has made a quiet calculation about where this is going. "Can you describe that?" he said. "When I was about 9, Claire said, a girl at school told me my family was weird, that it did not make sense. She was not being cruel. She was 9 years old. She just said it, the way children say things they have heard adults say. And I went home that afternoon thinking, I wish we looked more normal. I wish people did not stare. I wish I did not have to explain." She paused. "I was ashamed of being looked at differently. I spent a few years wishing our family was easier to explain to people who had not earned the explanation," Calloway said. "And would you say that experience—" "I was not finished," Claire said. He stopped. "I was ashamed of being seen differently," she said. "My father was never, not once, in 21 years, ashamed of loving us." She let that sit. "I know what it looks like when someone is ashamed of you. I know what it looks like when someone is tolerating you, managing you, keeping you around for a reason that has nothing to do with you. I have met those people. I have written about those people." She paused. "My father is not those people. The night I had a nightmare and he sat outside my door for hours because he did not want to frighten me by coming in, that is not surveillance. A man managing an asset does not fall asleep on the floor. A man performing goodness does not press his ear to a door and say, 'I am not going anywhere,' to a 6-year-old he has known for 4 days. She reached into her jacket pocket and set the blue kerchief on the railing of the witness box. "My mother gave me this. I have carried it every day for 27 years. It is the only thing I have left of her." She looked at it for a moment. "My father never once asked me to put it away, never told me it was time to stop carrying it, never suggested that holding on to my mother's memory was incompatible with being part of his family." She looked up. "He kept a box of his wife's things on his shelf for 21 years. He understood what it meant to hold on to someone." She looked at Calvin. "He taught me that," she said. "Not by telling me, by doing it." The room was absolutely still. Owen recalled Dorothy Haynes in the afternoon. Dorothy took the stand with the composed dignity of a woman who has been on stages of various kinds for 30 years and knows how to manage a room. She answered Owen's first questions in the smooth cadences of institutional authority, the fund's history, its programs, its impact, the number of children served, the grants received. Owen let her talk. Then, he set a document on the table in front of her. "Mrs. Haynes," he said, "I would like to direct your attention to the Children's Fund's Form 990 for the fiscal year ending June of 2014. Specifically, the line items under Program Service Expenses. Would you describe for the court what the vehicle maintenance allocation indicates?" Dorothy looked at the document. "That reflects the standard operating costs for our transportation program. And what was the actual amount paid to Harlan Auto and Repair for vehicle maintenance that year?" A pause. "I do not have that figure in front of me." Owen placed a second document beside the first. "This is the invoice record from Harlan Auto and Repair for the same period. The amount billed to the fund was $412. The amount recorded in the 990 under vehicle maintenance is $1,780. Would you like to explain the difference?" Dorothy said, "There may have been additional vendors." "There were not," Owen said. "I have the complete vendor payment records for that fiscal year, obtained through the Secretary of State's office." A third set of records followed the first two onto the table. This pattern appears in every fiscal year from 2010 through 2019, 9 years. Across 6 line items, the total discrepancy between actual expenditures and reported program costs is approximately $340,000. The gallery was quiet in a different way, now the way of a room recalibrating. Mrs. Haynes, I would also like to ask you about an email you sent in November of 2003, 3 months after my father applied for guardianship of my sister and me. He walked the printed email to the clerk. In this email, sent to the county social services supervisor, you write that you believe the placement with the Brooks household should be revisited, particularly with respect to the younger child, who would benefit from a more suitable domestic environment. You did not mention me in that email. Exclusively Claire. Can you explain why? Dorothy said nothing. I will help, Owen said. Terrence Webb, who served as the Children's Fund's accountant from 2005 to 2020, provided a deposition in which he describes a conversation in which you told him that Claire Whitfield was, and I am quoting his deposition directly, exactly the kind of child the fund needed for the annual campaign, young, photogenic, compelling, and that you were frustrated that the placement had gone to someone who, in your view, made the story more complicated. Dorothy's composure was still there, but it had thinned visibly. You could see the effort in it now. My father, Owen said, did not raise concerns about the fund's finances because he wanted to take down a civic institution. He raised them because he found discrepancies on his own invoices and believed someone should know. This lawsuit was filed 6 days after he made that inquiry. Not 6 months, not 6 weeks, 6 days. He looked at her steadily. Mrs. Haynes. This case was never about my father's fitness as a parent. It was about making sure he could not be believed. Dorothy opened her mouth. What came out was not what she intended. Later, no one could agree on exactly what broke first, whether it was the weight of the documents, or Claire's testimony still hanging in the air, or the quality of being looked at by a man she had underestimated for 21 years. Whatever it was, Dorothy Haynes leaned forward and said, in a voice stripped of its professional warmth, "Those children should have been raised by their own people." The words went into the room and did not come back. Several people in the gallery made sounds. One person stood. The judge called for order. Dorothy seemed to register, a moment after speaking, exactly what she had said and where she had said it, and the composure came back immediately, but it was too late. The room had heard it. The court reporter had recorded it. Calvin had heard it. Calvin sat at the defense table and looked at the middle distance and did not react, because he had heard versions of that sentence his entire adult life, and he had learned, long ago, that reacting to it in rooms like this one was a luxury he could not afford. Owen looked at his father for a single moment. Then he turned back to the bench and said, quietly, "No further questions." The judge's ruling came the following morning. The civil complaint was dismissed in its entirety. The court found no evidentiary basis for the claims of financial exploitation, psychological manipulation, or deliberate isolation. The judge noted, in language more pointed than strictly required, that the documentary record presented by the defense represented one of the more thorough accountings of parental responsibility she had encountered in a civil proceeding, and that the attempt to characterize that record as evidence of malice reflected a fundamental misreading of what the evidence actually showed. The financial records of the Children's Fund were referred to the State Attorney General's office. Dorothy Haynes left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. Calvin sat in the courtroom after almost everyone had filed out. Owen sat next to him. Claire sat on his other side. The room had the quality of a place that has held a great deal of human noise and is now returning, slowly, to itself. Calvin reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out the folded essay. He had put it there the night before, when he was pressing his shirt. He was not entirely sure why. It had seemed important to have it close. He unfolded it. The paper was soft at the creases after so many years. Claire's 11-year-old handwriting, careful, slightly tilted, ran across the lines in pencil. A family is not a thing that looks a certain way. A family is the person who stays outside the door the whole night, so you don't have to be afraid of the dark anymore. I know, because I have one. Claire looked at the paper in his hands. She did not say anything. Owen looked at it too. Calvin folded it again carefully, along the original creases. Then he put it in his shirt pocket, closer than evidence. He pressed his palm against it once, lightly. "Okay," he said finally, to neither of them in particular. "Okay," Owen said. They sat a little while longer. Then they got up and walked out of the courthouse together into the flat September light. In the weeks that followed, Calvin reopened the shop. The tow truck that had sat idle during the trial went back on the road. A few customers who had stopped coming returned without explanation, and Calvin accepted them without comment. Walter Sims brought his sedan in for an oil change, and they talked about the weather for 20 minutes and parted ways, and that was enough. The town did not apologize. Towns rarely do. But it adjusted, the way things adjust when a truth that has always been present finally becomes impossible to argue with. They went back to the church 4 months after the trial. It was not a plan. Owen had simply turned the car in that direction, and neither Calvin nor Claire had said otherwise. And then they were standing in the lot on Beaumont Road, looking at the old white building with its peeling paint and its patient windows. Calvin stood in front of it for a long time. He thought about Diana, about the Sundays she had spent inside organizing donated clothing, sorting canned goods, making coffee for whoever came through. About the birthday card in the wooden box, the last line he had read so many times in so many moods that he had nearly forgotten it could be read as something other than grief. "You are going to be such a good dad someday. I really believe that." It had simply turned out to be true. Owen came and stood beside him. Claire stood on his other side. "We could do something with this," Claire said. Owen said, "I know someone at the county zoning office." Calvin said, "Your mother used to come here on Sundays to help." Neither of them had heard him say this before. They were both still. "She would have liked this," Calvin said. "The idea of it." They stood in the lot together until the light began to change. The building was purchased and the renovation took 11 months, done partly by contractors and partly by Owen and Calvin on weekends. Claire designed the intake paperwork and wrote the founding mission statement, which was 1 paragraph long and said what it needed to say without ceremony. "This place exists for children who have been let go of. The only thing we offer is the same thing they deserve: someone who stays." The center was named Diana House. At the small opening ceremony, Calvin stood at the back and watched people move through the rooms: social workers, county officials, 2 foster families with children in tow, neighbors, Miss Adler who had driven up from Augusta and felt the specific quality of a moment you will carry for the rest of your life. Owen spoke briefly. He said that the law could clear a man's name, but it could not heal the part of him that had spent years wondering whether his love was enough, whether it was real, whether the world would someday prove it had been something other than what he knew it to be. "Only one thing does that," Owen said, "and it is not a verdict." He looked at Calvin at the back of the room. Calvin looked at the floor. His jaw was tight. He did not look up for a moment, because some things are too plain to look at directly. Claire, standing beside Owen, did not give a speech. She had already said what she needed to say on a witness stand, on the record, in front of the room. But she had also written one more thing. It ran in the county paper that same week, under her byline. The last paragraph said, "The man at the center of this case is not a symbol, and he would not want to be described as one. He is a mechanic from Harlan, Georgia, who found 2 children in the rain 21 years ago and made a decision that required no particular heroism, only the refusal to walk away. He has been asked, in various forms, to justify that decision ever since. He never stopped making it. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the right word for what that is. He just called it being a father." Calvin read the piece at the kitchen table that evening. He read it twice. Then he set it down and finished his coffee. He went to the shelf and opened the wooden box. Diana's photograph, her birthday card, the essay at the bottom, soft at the creases. He picked up the birthday card and read the last line one more time. "You are going to be such a good dad someday. I really believe that." He set it back. He placed the article beside it. He closed the box. He picked up his keys and went to open the shop.